Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you've been following the news, you know there's quite a controversy over the subject of public employee unions. Are they paid too much? Not enough? Are their benefits too good? Not good enough? Tonight, we're honored to have as our guest the director of Council 31 from the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, better known as AFSCME, to talk about what's happening with public unions and what their role is here in our American society today. This is Larry Spivack, director. Larry, welcome to the show.
I should clarify regional director.
Regional director.
So thank you very much.
But and also president of the Illinois Labor History Society,
right? That's right, and I'm glad to be here.
So let's start with, I think anybody who has been paying attention to what's happening in Wisconsin knows that there's a great battle still underway, and in other states, I think Ohio, Indiana. At the base of it, there's one side claiming that in fact, what they call is the bloated public unions, that they're overpaid, their benefits are they're unreasonable, and we have to cut, slash. On the other side is the argument that, actually I will let you make more eloquently, but basically that no, these are negotiated benefits that have been brought to the table by both sides and agreed to in good faith, so why is this suddenly a big deal? So if I have not summarized that correctly, let's start with how you see the situation.
Well, I think that Wisconsin is an interesting petri dish of what's happening in America right now and has been happening, especially for the last 30 years. Wisconsin is a state that has a liberal progressive tradition, the La Folla tradition, if people follow that kind of politics and understand that collective bargaining for public employees was born in Wisconsin. Collective bargaining, our union was born in Wisconsin in 1937, and collective bargaining rights by law with plenty of Republicans right on the page, with the right to citizens who work in the public sector having that right in 1959. So Wisconsin led the way on Social Security legislation, and although it did give us Joe McCarthy. And that's kind of what we have now, in a way where we're demonizing a certain sector of people. But the thing that I think to understand is, why is that happening? Why is it happening? I think for many of us, and many more now, are beginning to understand that this is about an attempt to grab as much power as possible by the corporations. It's a corporate agenda.
But this is government. This is in Wisconsin, it's the governor himself, a member of government, elected official, who's making these cuts. So how is that corporate? Well,
it's corporate in that he is primarily funded by very wealthy corporations. This is, we're going to hear more and more about the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that basically is going to give unfettered rights to corporations to give as much money to politicians as they want.
Well, it gave the same right to unions, though.
Well, except that unions are by exponentially smaller in terms of their financial ability to give. And what you do then is, if unions are giving money more to Democrats than Republicans, what you do is pass legislation that says that the union no longer has the right to collect money, to have a contract, which means it can't collect political action money. It's not dues money, because political action money is a separate deduction, and people should understand that. But there will be no organization that can collect to have dues-paying members, then you have no organization to provide money for politicians.
Well, is that because in Wisconsin, part of the legislation that passed was that the unions could no longer have the union dues deducted from paychecks of the government employees? Exactly,
and that would mean that, and also it basically would mean they wouldn't have any real rights to bargain. They've tried to eliminate it. We represent 20,000 state employees in Wisconsin in that council, and the governor has terminated the contract and said the union rights no longer exist, and he can do as he pleases, because under the legislation that passed, it affected state employees. And so right now there is no collection of dues or union political action money. What I'm really trying to get at is that the corporate agenda, that the Koch brothers, for instance, are billionaires
in the oil industry, right?
Their paper, paper, every kind of paper is a big part of what they do. I don't even know. They have many companies. They fund the policy organizations. They fund the walkers. They fund the think tanks. Governor Walker, to take these extreme positions, because their idea is, if we can bust the unions, and now since unions are primarily in the public sector, A lot of Americans don't realize that only 6.9% of the private sector workforce is in a union, but 37% of the public sector is. And so we are the last kind of pillar of defense against this corporate agenda.
Well, but is there validity at all in Governor Walker's position? So, for example, it is in Illinois, for example, public pensions have been woefully underfunded. Now that's the fault of the politicians for not.
It's a 40-year problem.
That's a 40-year problem that the funding has not been. The politicians have not done their fiduciary duty in funding those pensions. But the pensions of public employee unions are structured in such a way that, so for example, I could, if I got a job when I was 20, I could work 30 years, be fully vested in my pension, retire at the age of 50, get a full pension from my state pension fund, and still work for another 15 years at some other job and double dip.
Well, it's not quite accurate. First of all, these were constitutional rights. In Illinois, as an example, it's simply a constitutional right, and there's a reason for it. How do you get people to want to be in public service? Teachers do not pay into Social Security. The average teacher pension in Illinois is $45,000 a year, no Social Security. It's not like they're living off the trough. The average state employee in Illinois' pension is $20,000 a year after 34 years of service.
So let me see if I get this right. So the average state worker, that would be anybody who works for the state of Illinois?
Yes.
So if you work for the actual state, then your pension is, the average pension is 24, did you say?
$20,000 a year.
$20,000
Yes.
a year.
And a teacher, it's about $45,000, somebody who's worked 34 years, 35 years. And so most people, yeah, there's a rule of 85 that combined service plus the age of 55 and you can retire. Okay, you can go work somewhere else, but the point is that it's not a very large pension. Illinois is one of the bottom in the country. Now it's about 26th in the country in average public employee pension. But Wisconsin, I should say, is one of the best. Wisconsin is has very little pension problem. And this is really...
You mean they don't have the underfunded
They don't have the
underfunded,
yes, right. They're quite healthy. And Wisconsin, as I call it a petri dish to try to get rid of unions because unions represent the average worker, and the average worker who has a voice on the job is it's sort of the antithesis to if you're a CEO. You want everything. You know, we know that 2% of the population makes over $250,000 a year, which means 98% make less than that. I'm talking about the average salary of a teacher who we entrust our children to teachers for 6 hours, 7 hours a day. Who is more important? And they're going to work for 34 years and bring home $45,000 a year. What you see in the newspaper and in the media is the one administrator, the superintendent, or the police chief, or something like that. 99% of the public employees have actually, I think it was quite interesting because there was an article in the Tribune today, not an article, but a letter. Somebody wrote in to talk about Tony Preckwinkle, the Cook County president, the new president, who said that we're going to have to figure out a way to pay, to share in the cost of things. And the person who wrote this letter said that, think about what she's saying. Most workers do not have these things, and no workers should expect them. And that was good benefits and a pension because it's been taken away in the private sector.
And so the letter writer is saying no one should expect this level of benefits?
That's what Preckwinkle is now saying, that no one else should expect this in the public sector because they don't have it anymore in the private sector. She goes on to say, when did it become unreasonable to expect to have a decent lifestyle and a secure retirement? Well, never fear. If the CEOs, billionaires, and their political puppets have their way, political puppets being Walker and people like that, the governor of Ohio, and so on, if they have their way, workers will become poor while the rich continue to get richer. My question is, what happens to a consumer-driven economy when people can no longer afford to consume, which is what we've seen in over the last 30 years as the puppets of these corporations have destroyed the right to collective bargaining in the private sector. Wages have fallen for those 30 years. And so now that they've been able to do that, and the profits are as great as they've ever been, the 400 wealthiest people in this country control half the country's wealth in terms of assets. Why should it, and their taxes are lower than they've ever been. This is great for them and terrible for the average working person.
But isn't it true, though, that with these kinds of pension obligations, as people continue to live longer and longer, that it becomes more and more a component of what the state has to spend. And taxpayers fund those pensions. So doesn't it create an unsustainable situation?
Let me clarify one thing that much of the public do not understand is that the workers themselves pay into the pension. The teachers paid for their pension by having the money deducted. So they have thousands of dollars deducted. It's not just free money that they get. They have that money like any pension. It's not totally dissimilar to a 401k that a few people still have, but what it does is it's defined, and so that it's going to be a certain percent of your final income. But
that depends on the particular contract, doesn't it? With the
right.
Some teacher contracts, the school itself
but it's
picks
generally
up the
case.
Right?
But the point is that the workers themselves have paid for their pension for 30 or 40 years or 25 years or whatever it's been, and it's not a gift from government. It's simply it's a savings plan, is what it is, and it's a different kind. And yes, public employees are paid by the public, but do we want a society where we have poorly paid teachers and we have people who work in public nursing homes that get no benefits? And that's already happened in the private sector, and what we've seen is the degradation of our society as a result. It reminds me of a quote from Sidney Hillman, who was the founder of the Textile Workers Union, and he said, "We want a better America, an America that will give its citizens, first of all, a higher standard of living so that no child will cry for food in the midst of plenty." And this is what we're moving to because we're losing a middle class that was built by the right to collectively bargain, which gave workers some voice on the job, some power in society against this corporate elite. And now the studies have come out, incontrovertible evidence, that the wage gap in wealth between the rich and the poor, or the rich and everybody else really in America, is now at an 80-year high. The stratification of wealth, 80-year high. And so corporations are saying, we can do this if we eliminate unions, because unions once bargained for all of America. And then we have unfettered right to just take everything. That's how we see it in the union movement, but we believe that it's really all Americans who benefit. Social Security legislation, Medicare, Fair Labor Standards Act, all this social legislation comes from unions having some power to put on politicians and on corporations to share in the wealth.
So why is it that public sentiment seems certainly to have turned against public unions, well, unions generally, but public unions now particularly, that teachers are seen as having an unfair great gig? They only work 8 months of the year. They get lots of vacation time. They only work 7 hours a day. It seems like a free ride, and then they get this fabulous pension, or at least they get a pension that's guaranteed.
Well, it's a brilliant strategy by I always use the corporate agenda, because it's not all Republicans. It's a corporate agenda, and they use primarily Republicans to push the agenda. They own the newspapers. They write the stories. They own the news media, the show, everything that we watch and hear. And it's been a long campaign. And, you know, this has been, part of it is that taxes do feel high. If you're a person that's unemployed, if you're on a fixed income, and all your property taxes now where there's a small tax base, and so it's fairly significant. It's hard to pay $10,000 a year in taxes. I mean, schools should be funded on the state, not by property taxes. But the state of Illinois, as an example, has been ignorant, if I can use such a strong word, about our political system for so many years, and not looking at the public funding of education in a proper way, so that now we are paying a price. And to go back to the issue of pensions, do we want to bring everybody, is this a race to the bottom for everybody? So if we can pit public workers against, or private workers against public workers, saying, well, I don't have it anymore, you shouldn't, it's a race to the bottom. And so it should be the other argument, which is not, I don't have what you have. It should be, I would like to have what you have, and we should have better labor laws so that workers can organize in this country instead of being fired every time they try to organize a union, which they are.
Well, and is this, now with, particularly going back to Wisconsin, part of that legislation that was recently passed says that anyone who goes on strike can be fired immediately.
Yeah. This is like, again, I use strong words, but this is like living in a fascist society, if you could say that you cannot collect unemployment because you're on strike. Striking the right to strike is a fundamental right in every developed democratic country in the
Well,
world.
including here, isn't it protected by federal labor law?
Well, it's not enforced anymore because Reagan, in 1981, President Reagan fired their traffic controllers.
Although they had a no-strike clause.
The point is that the boss of the country said to every corporate CEO in the country, there's no law that protects, you have the right to strike, but there's no law that says that you can't permanently replace strikers, and that didn't happen before, almost never. But when Reagan did it, every corporation in America said, come on and strike and we'll replace you.
Including the National Football League, as a matter of fact.
As a matter of fact. And so it is now, there's no right to strike in this country. That would be like a third world dictatorship.
Well, you can still strike. It's not forbidden.
It's not forbidden, but it doesn't happen in the private sector because you'll be replaced, because the law allows that. The probably is injurious as that is, the saying that if you can't collect unemployment or food stamps or whatever because your family is on strike, or a worker in the family is on strike, the fact that the law is basically unenforceable under current labor law, that if you try to organize a union, you'll be fired. 20,000 workers a year are fired for trying to organize a union. Gee, no wonder there's only 6.9% in the private sector. And I'm talking about private sector law right now. In the public sector, it's easier to organize because we can put pressure on politicians, which is a good thing. It's a democratic system. There's representation, and we can say to the politicians, labor is good. And in fact, a lot of governors, like here in Illinois, have said collective bargaining is fundamentally important to a better society.
But that actually brings up another point that is frequently cited in the current news stories, and that is the Governor Walker's position, for example, is that the unions support politicians who support the union benefits, and so therefore it's taxpayer money that pays the union members, that pays the union dues in order to elect politicians. So the taxpayers are paying to elect the politicians, and he sees that as wrong.
I think it's a specious argument. I think it's cover. He's using corporate welfare. The biggest welfare in this country is to corporations at every single level, agribusiness subsidies, and we could go on and on. It's all corporations are subsidized by these private companies, and or whether they're publicly held by stockholders, are primarily supported by the public because of all the public subsidies and the tax breaks and so on. That's our money. Now, to say that we're electing politicians who we're using taxpayer money to elect politicians, I think, again, it's not just a specious argument, it's wrong, incorrect, and in fact, the question is, what kind of society, what kind of quality of life do we want? Do we want a society where we support politicians who support good public service? The state parks are closing everywhere. The federal government is cutting back on VA benefits. These are the people who've given their lives, right, and we're cutting back on them, but billionaires are growing out of the dust because of their corporate subsidies, and it makes no sense. And it is time that Americans realize that we have a lot more in common as workers, that 90% of us control about 10% of the wealth. I said before, 400 Americans, but that is the 400 richest Americans actually are worth the same amount as the 155 of the poorest Americans.
155
million. Right, because
half the population.
Yeah, half the population. So this is so out of whack, but Americans are uninformed. That's one reason that I'm involved in the Labor History Society, to tell this story over and over again. As president of the Labor History Society, we go out and do programs. We're going to have a great event on May 1st to reclaim our history here in Forest Park, the Haymarket Monument, the most important labor site in the entire world. And no Americans know the story, that the fight for the 8-hour day and that the fight for International Workers' Day, that's the most popular holiday in the world, is because of 8 workers who were picked out, selected, and hanged because they were union leaders for no other reason. There's a pretext about all of that, and people should go to IllinoisLaborHistory.org, IllinoisLaborHistory.org, to hear the story, to read the story, but come out on May 1st, because it's not a holiday about Soviets and communism. It's a holiday about Chicagoans who are immigrants and who fought for the right of immigrants and the right of workers to have the right to collectively bargain.
But we have Labor Day here in the United States.
Well, that was a holiday that Grover Cleveland formed after he saw the popularity of May Day, and that the May Day was getting people to say, hey, we should celebrate this all around the world. And so in 1892, Grover Cleveland came and said the first Monday in October to give a holiday to workers. But
now, the Haymarket incident that you mentioned, that was back in the 1800s.
1886.
Right? So this struggle has been going on for over 150 years.
It's a struggle of industrialism in America. There was a time when we said that if we can pay children to work 12 hours a day, that's okay, because we could pay them a very low wage. We said that was okay. We said that
we as a society.
As a society,
okay.
And we have to change the consciousness of people. There was a time when we said slavery, free labor was okay as a society, although there were, no shortage of abolitionists. There was a time when women didn't have the right to vote until 1920. So these are these are the same questions of civil rights. Economic justice and social justice are inextricably linked in the mind of most of us who are active in labor. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, because he was at a sanitation workers' strike. My union AFSCME, it was the night before of the assassination that he gave the great "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, where he pretty much said he knew he wasn't going to live. But he was fighting for the sanitation workers' right to get union recognition. They were black, they didn't have the right in Memphis, and they had a union, but they weren't recognized by the city. They didn't have collective bargaining rights by law, and 27 states don't have collective bargaining rights for public employees by law. And so this issue of collective bargaining is just simply cover for corporations to take money out of your pocket to keep for themselves. I see it no other way.
But isn't that ultimately self-defeating? I mean, the corporations, if they make a ton of money, but there's no one to buy their products, ultimately it's self-defeating. I mean, even Henry Ford, great industrialist and not exactly a liberal icon, Henry Ford recognized that if he didn't pay his workers enough money to buy the cars that his company was making, that it didn't do any good.
That's a major contradiction in the system. I mean, corporations, Walmart's a great example, and people have this struggle around Walmart. Walmart has put out every single little business in every little town in America, the largest private employer in the country now,
and
Walmart, non-unionized. The largest grocer in the United States is putting large groceries out of business. It's a contradiction in the system, so it becomes a monopoly of cheap foreign labor. Back to the race to the bottom, you go to Walmart, you buy cheap goods. I just thought about this, that you can say that our labor history is in our closet, because go back to Cindy Hillman and the textile workers, when people finally built a union and they built a living wage for workers. Now we don't even have our clothes made in Mexico anymore because they make $7 a day, so you go to China for 25 cents an hour. And think about that, 25 cents an hour, these garment factories in China and Cambodia and Malaysia and Indonesia and so on, because Mexico is too expensive. So how many billions do you actually need to live on? And I think that this is
But
really
ultimately,
the question.
this is if the thesis is correct, this is a just self-destructive path. And,
yes.
And one would think that if it's true, then no one willingly undertakes a self-destructive
Except
path.
that if you look at this recession and the whole crisis over the derivatives and all of that, this creation of Goldman's, of Wall Street, they brought down the economy. They lost thousands of workers, and a number of them went under as a result. But that is the history of business in America. I mean, some people believe that that's how business should work, that it's survival of the fittest.
And boom and bust.
For boom and bust. That's going to happen. And as long as you have a system where it's not planned in any way, where it's unfettered, where there is no regulation, you have sickness, you have health, you have disease, you have greed, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's not that way everywhere in the world, despite worldwide global crisis. You go to northern European countries and even southern Europe now, and people have, it's very, very different. There are corporations, they're capitalistic, but they also say that the distribution of wealth should be more even, as it once was in this country. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that there was a time in this country when it was more even, and we built a strong middle class, and people didn't have to live at home until they were 30. They were able to
get married and buy a house
and get a union job. A union job that paid a good wage that was good for America. And so that's the different vision. Is it Wall Street or is it Main Street? And Main Street has gotten confused because Wall Street is the one that writes the news. And so we're saying, let's take this back and let's think about what we did after 1935 when the National Labor Relations Act was passed, and we gave workers rights for the, legal rights for the first time. There were unions before that, but this was, the President of the United States said, Franklin Roosevelt, if I worked in a factory, I would join a union.
So we don't hear that from Washington today.
No, we don't.
Even from the White House, we don't hear that. In fact, the White House will tell us that, yes, we have to cut spending, it's just a matter of how much. So is that, and actually it's an interesting question, do you see these as being linked, this urge to slash government spending coupled with the urge to slash government unions?
Absolutely. And
or public sector unions, I should say.
Absolutely. There was a time when corporations contributed 28% of the federal revenue in this country. Now it's about 7%. And so that's exactly the shift of the distribution of wealth. And so the idea is that if you can create legislation, and it's, even though corporations generally exist on a 90-day cycle, what's the next quarter going to mean in terms of profit, they have the think tank people that they employ think way in advance and come up with a way to convince the public through propaganda that, in our case, public sector workers are sponges and parasites, when in fact it's, I would argue, just the opposite, that the corporations are the sponges and parasites. They can afford, as long as we have a system of unfettered capitalism, which we pretty much have, like we did in the 1880s and 1870s, when the trade union movement began and strong because of it. And now Wisconsin, going back full circle, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of people showing up in Madison who are not, most of them aren't in unions. There are people who are saying, oh my goodness, this governor is trying to take away basic rights. And we now understand that this is not just economic justice, it's social justice, and social justice is economic justice.
Well, I thought it was intriguing that the police and firefighters, who are exempt from the law passed in Wisconsin, nonetheless came out in support of the protests.
Well, they have the right to collective bargaining, and they realize that the soon will come after them. The old quote, first they came after the Jews, and I said nothing, then they came after the gays, and I said nothing, then they came after the communists, I said nothing, and then they came after me, and there was no one left. And I think they understand that, in a way, this is all of a sudden we're in a crisis that we've never seen. That's why there's going to be a call for a mobilization across the country honoring Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy the week of April 4th, and April 9th is the Chicago rally. There'll be rallies throughout the country, saying, let's bring justice back for the average person, which is most of us.
Well, to our viewers, those dates will have passed by the time they see this. But on the web,